Okay, so here's today. So in special senses, we were covering the eyes and the ears. Normally we do tongue and nose as well, but we're doing the shortened version this year. So today is the bigger of the two. Today we're going to talk about anatomy of the ear and we'll hit some physiology as well. And then Thursday we'll do physiology of equilibrium because our ears handle both hearing and equilibrium. So I've already posted the 2 PowerPoints for the week. I posted 2 reading guides, just like last week. Kind of, you can be in charge of your own schedule this week. I just need those in by Friday. I also put in 3 self-checks. So I worked on your exam this weekend and I have 25 labeling on the exam day. So I have a skeleton front and back, a muscle man front and back, and a skull. So I put in self-checks for each individual item so that you can kind of self-assess, can I label these things? So there'll be no surprises come test day, right? So if you can mark them all off, you know that you're ready for that portion of the test. Outside of class, you're also working on the exam review packet that showed up in week 19. So we have a lot of stuff posted right now. So this week is week 18. Here's your 2 reading guides. Here are the 3 exam preps, just self-checks. So it's really just part of your own self-assessment for preparation. And then the exam review packet right here, which I went to print off yesterday and I'm out of print or ink. So I had to go to a couple different stores looking for ink. And it turns out there's a nationwide printer ink shortage. So I wasn't able to print that. But anywho, that's what I learned yesterday. All right, anybody have any topics they want to throw out for the day before we get started? Anybody have anything crazy happen over the weekend? See the continued news about Wednesday's events continuing to unfold. This morning there was a kind of like a video montage, I guess, on the morning news. They were showing clips of from a number of different perspectives, I guess, from a number of different people's cameras, and it was more intense than I had imagined, as it turns out. I mean, I got the idea of it Wednesday, but looking at the videos, I didn't realize, like, you can say thousands of people, but I didn't realize what a huge force it was and how many people were actually in the building. Just craziness. So I was telling my morning class, I remember working on the day of 9/11, and Mr. Duda was our principal, and he walked through the hallways. It was my prep hour, and he's like, "Kim, you better turn on the TV," because back then we had TVs hanging up from the wall instead of the big white screens. And I turned on just before the second plane hit the towers, and it was just like, you just didn't know what was going on. It was like, thought we were at war, didn't know what was going to happen next. All kinds of calls were starting to come on with like building threats of bombs, which I think they all were just taking advantage of the plane situation. They weren't actually bombs, but it's like everywhere you looked, there was chaos. And it kind of seemed a little bit like that Wednesday, except it wasn't in multiple places. It was just in one place. But it sure had me like glued to the TV, and still today, still glued to the news, wanting to hear more and more and more about it. So I don't know if that is on your end the same thing. Like, I didn't get a lot of papers graded Wednesday. That's kind of where I've been with that. So on other notes, I'm all ears. So we're going to talk about the ears today. We're going to talk about anatomy and physiology. This link right here is an awesome link. So if you weren't going to go to lecture, for example, this is a really nice website that walks you through the learning process of the ear, and like what all the structures are, and what all the structures do. So if you want to investigate that, it helps you like, what are each of these individual structures? I put that link in there for you. I'm just pointing out how helpful I think it is. So the ear is responsible for hearing and balance. Today we're doing the hearing component. So of course our objectives, like always, identify pieces and parts and what they do, right? So you should be able to identify all of these structures. I was going to have that as like your one thing to turn in today, but it's part of your reading guide, so I decided I didn't need you to do it twice. But also when you label this, you want to be able to say what each structure does, right? So, so that can be a practice page for you if you'd like. Then we can divide the ear into 3 sections, which you saw in that PowerPoint that I started with. Or not PowerPoint, but that website. So you have the outer ear, which of course is the piece you can see, right? That's the visible portion of the ear. The middle ear, which, do you remember we talked about the external auditory meatus when we talked about the temporal lobe or the temporal bone? And that would be the middle ear. And then deep inside of that is the inner ear. And this is where the senses are actually turned into impulses, right? We talk about sensory receptors. We've been talking about that for 2 chapters now. And that those sensory receptors will have an action potential, and then they send signals to the brain. So that happens deep inside the inner ear. So outer and middle ear are only for hearing, and then the inner ear is also for equilibrium. So both, you know, when you get that dizzy feeling, perhaps, or you're on a snowmobile for many hours and then you get off the snowmobile and you're laying in bed and you're like, oh my God, I feel like I'm still on the snowmobile, or something like that. You get the idea. When you feel like you're still moving after you're no longer moving, that would be equilibrium. So that's the inner ear. So the outer ear is the fleshy part of our ear, right? We call that the pinna. So the pinna may also be called the auricle. So the fleshy part of your ear, the inner or the pinna, acts like a band shell. For those of you who are in band or choir, and you know how you set up that framework behind the choir, which is basically funneling sound out into the crowd, right? Our ear works the same way, only it's funneling the sound inward. So the shape of our outer ear is actually shaped to capture, like a funnel, all of the sound waves coming at us and then direct them inward. And then the external auditory canal is that meatus that we talked about before. It is in the temporal bone. So if you had damage to the temporal bone, that was going to damage your hearing abilities. But it has some special features that are part of our first line of defense against infection. Okay, so it has modified sweat glands. These sweat glands are called ceruminous glands, and they produce cerumen. So the ear wax that you clean out with your Q-tips is called cerumen. And many of our openings, they have mucous membranes or sticky substances that can collect dust, debris, bacteria before it enters our internal body, right? So it's our first line of defense against disease. And so that's actually the purpose of earwax. Moving on past that inner ear, we're getting into the middle ear, and the dividing line is called the middle or the tympanic membrane. Sorry, I was reading while I was talking. So this right here, you know it as the eardrum, right? So when a sound wave hits that, it starts vibrating, and that's what's going to send the signals further inside of our ear. So eardrum or tympanic membrane is the dividing line between our outer and our middle ear. Our middle ear is directly connected to our throat. Our throat is called our pharynx. So we have the eustachian tube or auditory tube that is diagonal through from our middle ear down into our throat. A lot of times you have maybe an ear infection and then you get a sore throat because that infection is draining through that eustachian tube. Or vice versa, you might have an infection in your throat and then before too long you have an earache. And that again is because that infection can spread through that eustachian tube. The purpose of the eustachian tube is to equalize pressure. So you've experienced this if you've ever gone flying or diving. So as you change altitude, you know you're changing the external pressure on our bodies, the pressure that is pressed on us. The auditory tube, the eustachian tube, its job is to equalize the air pressure outside of our body and inside of our body. So as we dive, for example, we increase atmospheric pressure, 1 atmospheric pressure every 33 feet. So as you dive down, you have more pressure pressed on you, and this eustachian tube starts to close. And so you get that pinched feeling. Sharp pain maybe on the inside of your ear. You experience a similar pain when you go up in the air. So a lot of us maybe chew gum to clear our eustachian tube, to keep it open. So when you get that sore feeling, it's closing on you. As adults, your eustachian tube is diagonal, whereas infants, it's more horizontal, as you see in this picture here. So they're not able to equalize your pressure as much. So if you've ever been on the plane with a baby, you'll hear that baby cry quite a bit. Sometimes the ear canal fails to drop in that diagonal, and then often babies will have tubes put in to help hold that canal open in order to maintain that equalization of air pressure. So continuing on, that membrane, that tympanic membrane, the eardrum, it's now in motion, right? Because sound waves traveling through the air hit it, and like a drum, it starts to vibrate. Then it's going to hit 3 small bones inside of your ear called ossicles. So here we have 3 ossicles. They're named according to their shape. So you have the malleus, a mallet is a hammer. You have the anvil or incus. I don't know how to describe an anvil exactly, kind of like a stake. And then a stirrup or stapes. So it's shaped like the stirrup on a horse saddle, for example. So the tympanic membrane vibrates, hits the malleus starts to vibrate, that hits the next bone, the anvil, and then that hits, I ran out of frame, and then that hits the stirrup. Eventually the stirrup hits this oval window, and now you're in the inner ear. So now those sound waves are once again going to be turned into waves, but in a liquid form. Okay. So this is what's going to happen in the inner ear. So here's our stapes, our stirrup, and our oval window. So this whole structure is called a labyrinth. You know, a labyrinth is a maze, right? So it's a hollowed out portion of the temporal bone. It's not like pictures always make it look like it's something you could take and hold and investigate, but it's really not. It's a hollowed out canal in our skull. It has a membrane inside of it, so we refer to this gray portion as the bony labyrinth, the hard part of the maze. And the pink part is a membranous labyrinth. So inside of the canal, there's a membrane surrounding the whole thing. And these 2 spaces are fluid filled. Okay, so you have the bony labyrinth and the oval window. Once the stapes hits the oval window, which is a membrane, it'll create fluid movement inside of this bony labyrinth. This fluid is called perilymph. So you have endolymph inside and perilymph around. We've had peri in almost every chapter, right? Around. So the perilymph begins a fluid-like motion. It'll hit the membranous labyrinth, which then causes the endolymph to go into motion. And this is eventually what is going to hit the cells themselves. They create signals. Okay, so endolymph to perilymph. This is the whole structure of the inner ear. This coiled portion here, that to me it looks like a snail. This coiled portion is called the cochlea. This is where we have hair cells, which are sensory cells related to hearing. In this section here, the middle portion is called the vestibule and entryway. The vestibule is related to static equilibrium. So that's simply, am I standing upright? Am I on my left, on my right? Am I on my head? Am I moving forward? Am I moving backwards? It's linear motion. And then these loop-de-loops, which kind of look like the corkscrew at Cedar Point, are called the semicircular canal. So those are pretty easy because they look semicircular, right? And we kind of get dizzy when we're going through loops, correct? So if you get off a roller coaster and you feel like you're still on it, that's your dynamic equilibrium. So this is more angular motion. So these are the three portions of that inner ear. They all have mechanoreceptors. Remember, we had photoreceptors in our eye responding to light. So mechanoreceptors respond to mechanical vibrations. All right, and they look like this: sensory cells, bipolar, just like in the eye, only this time they have these little dendrites that are hair-like structures, so they're called hair cells. So all of the hair cells will have fluid motion on the outside that somehow bends those hair cells. So maybe this membrane, when the fluid hits it, it causes the hair cells to bend over. And that will cause the action potential that eventually sends signals to our temporal lobe, the auditory cortex of the brain. Okay, so all of this bending, like if you keep over bending it by listening to loud music, think of grass. The more you stomp on your grass, it kind of flattens out, right? So that happens with overuse and that very loud music, for example. It'll cause those hair cells to no longer bounce back, and then they're no longer able to send signals. So that's where like that deafening effect comes from. So how do we hear? Basically, it's a chain of events, right? So you want to be able to just practice this by creating a flow chart, talking about the sound waves from outside of our ear, and then labeling all of the structures that they hit as they move through the ear. Okay, so sound waves will first hit that tympanic membrane. That begins a vibration, which then hits the hammer or malleus, which then hits the incus, which then hits the stapes, which then hits the oval window, setting the perilymph in motion, and then the endolymph in motion. As it moves through the inner ear of the cochlea, where those hair cells are located is called the organ of Corti. And we're going to zoom in on that here in a minute. So I kind of talked through all of this. So the stapes hits the oval window, which hits the perilymph, which then hits the endolymph. The fluid will then stimulate the hair cells in the organ of Corti. Those then send signals on the auditory nerve to the temporal lobe of the brain. So this is a zoomed in order to get to that organ of Corti. So this is your whole ear, right? And we're going to take just this piece, the inner ear, and we're going to zoom in. So this is zoomed in. I can see my bony labyrinth right here. Now I'm going to zoom in on just that portion of the cochlea. So I'm zoomed in on the cochlea. I can see the bony labyrinth, the membranous labyrinth. And here's my hair cells. This is the organ of Corti, where the sound is actually transmitted. So zoomed in on that. This is my organ of Corti. I can see the hair cells that are the sensory receptors. I see the endolymph, this fluid, and the tectoral membrane. As the fluid moves, the tectoral membrane will press on these hair cells. That creates the action potential that sends signals to the brain. It's a whole lot of words coming at you right now, so you just have to stop and take time to create that flow chart, and that's really the best way to study that process. So I am going to show you a video. It's less than 2 minutes. I like the videos because they have animation, so you can get a better visual of what's actually happening. Okay?
The ear has three parts: the outer ear or auricle, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The auricle, the visible part of the ear, collects sound waves and directs them to the auditory canal, The auditory or ear canal is lined with cilia and ceruminous glands. The earwax from the ceruminous gland and the cilia protect the ear from entry by foreign matter. The thin tympanic membrane separates the outer ear from the middle ear. Sound waves cause it to vibrate. The three tiny bones of the middle ear are the hammer or malleus, anvil or incus, and stapes or stirrup. These bones pick up the vibrations from the tympanic membrane and transmit them to the inner ear. The eustachian tube of the middle ear opens into the pharynx and permits air pressure to equalize between the ear and the outside air. The inner ear is maze-like, consisting of bony and membranous structures surrounded by fluid. The semicircular canals are fluid-filled bony loops that help maintain our body's balance. The cochlea is a fluid-filled, snail-shaped structure that houses the organ of Corti, the true organ of hearing. The fluid aids in the transmission of the vibrations. The organ of Corti changes the vibrations into nerve impulses that are picked up by the auditory nerve. Sound waves are collected by the auricle or outer ear and sent to the auditory canal, tympanic membrane, ear bones, and then to the cochlea, where the vibrations are changed by the organ of Corti to nerve impulses and transmitted by the auditory or cochlear nerve to the temporal lobe of the brain for interpretation.
So that's all taking advantage of that action potential.
The ear has three.
Interesting tidbits. Hearing is the last sense, like of your special senses, right? It's the last sense that you lose when you fall asleep, and it's the first sense that you gain when you wake up again. So probably that's why our like alarm clocks are sound based instead of heat or light or sickles or anything like that, because we are aware of sounds before we're aware of the rest of our environment. And the same thing when you go to sleep, except in reverse, right? So it's the last sense that is still active. So you can be asleep, but you're still hearing, right? So it's the last sense you lose. Some have taken advantage of that with learning. I know this is something I used to do when I was in high school. I would read all my notes when I was getting ready for my exams. I'd read them into a recorder, and then I'd play my recorder while I fell asleep. And you can buy, I know like some of the foreign language formats are like learn French while you sleep, and it's talking while you go to sleep, and you're still, because your hearing is still picking up information, it's still sending signals to your brain, and your brain is filing that. So that's kind of cool. If you ever are unfortunate enough to have a friend or a family member who's maybe in a coma, this is something to keep in mind. That sense of sound is still with them. So even though they're not awake, they're taking in that information, and the brain is deciding what to do about it. So you talk to them and you fill them with your positive thoughts. That can be very helpful. This link is nothing I'm going to ask you to do necessarily, but if you want, you can click on the image and it leads you to a hearing test, and it'll go through a number of frequencies. And I noticed like I was more in tune to the high pitched frequencies, but it'll read off like 17 hertz, 18, 19, and it'll have a beep that comes next. So you just listen for when you can finally hear the beep, and that's kind of your auditory threshold, if you will. Okay. So that's what I have for our vision, our hearing today. Like I said, you have 2 reading guides that are due by Friday. So you can decide where you need to spend your time today, where you need to spend your time Wednesday. We also have our exam review packet. It's very large, so you don't want to wait to do that till the very end, right? You should be working on that little by little all along. At this point, you can answer everything from chapter 8 except for the last question. We haven't done equilibrium yet. And then these exam preps, when you feel like you're ready for labeling, it's just a checklist. Can I label? Will I know where the temporal lobe is? Yes. Do I know the parietal lobe? And you can kind of test yourself. And if you can say yes to all of those, you just go check, check, check. And it's just a way of being aware of what you need to know, right? Total transparency, if you will. So there's no surprises. Okay, so that's what I have for you today. Anybody have any questions about the goings on or hearing or anatomy of the ear in particular? All right, then, if you have any individual questions about assignments, quizzes, tests that you need to make up, stick around. Otherwise, you are free to go.